The Arizona sun hammered down on Falcon Mesa Air Base like a punishment from heaven, turning the tarmac into a shimmering sea of heat waves that made everything dance in the distance. By 9 o'clock in the morning, the temperature had already climbed past 90 degrees and the day was just getting started. Smart people stayed indoors during hours like these, huddled around air conditioning units and cold drinks, waiting for the sun to lose some of its fury. But not everyone had that luxury. And for some, the blistering heat was just another day in a long career defined by endurance and unwavering commitment. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Serafina Hayes wasn't most people. She walked through the chain-link gates of Falcon Mesa with the kind of quiet confidence that came from years of knowing exactly where she belonged, even when everyone else thought she didn't. No uniform adorned her frame. No visible rank announced her status. Just well-worn desert boots that had seen real desert, cargo pants that fit like they'd been lived in, and a simple ponytail that revealed the tan line where aviators usually rested. Everything about her seemed understated, ordinary even, except for the way she moved. There was something deliberate about her stride, economical and precise, like someone who'd learned that wasted motion could be the difference between coming home and not coming home at all. The gate guard barely glanced up from his clipboard, just waved her through with the bored efficiency of someone counting down the hours until lunch. Serafina nodded once and kept walking, her small duffel bag slung over one shoulder, paperwork folded neatly in her back pocket. She'd been up since 5 that morning, sitting on the edge of a motel bed that smelled like industrial disinfectant and decades of other people's problems. The kind of place that rented rooms by the week and didn't ask questions about why someone might need that kind of arrangement. Her gear bag had sat open on the room's single chair, contents organized with the kind of military precision that becomes second nature after enough years of service. Clean clothes folded tight, toiletries in a clear bag, and at the bottom, wrapped in a faded bandana, a photograph she hadn't looked at in 3 months. She'd pulled it out that morning, held it up to the weak light filtering through dusty Venetian blinds, and made herself remember. 3 figures on a helipad somewhere in Afghanistan, dust devils swirling in the background. Her in the middle, flight helmet tucked under her arm, flanked by her crew chief and her co-pilot. All of them squinting against the sun, all of them young enough to think they were invincible. The crew chief had made it home, got out, started a family in Ohio. According to his Christmas cards, he coached Little League now and had never been happier. The co-pilot never made it past the 3rd deployment. An improvised explosive device took his bird down in a valley whose name she still couldn't say out loud. His son was graduating from flight school next month, had his father's eyes and his father's stubborn streak, and absolutely no idea that Captain Serafina Hayes existed. She'd promised herself she'd take one last flight before his graduation ceremony. Not for glory, not for some kind of closure that therapists talked about, but just to prove to herself that she could still touch the sky without falling apart. Inside the operations tent, the air conditioning fought a losing battle against the desert heat. 2 flight instructors lounged in folding chairs, one wearing aviators indoors like it was still 1986, the other clutching a protein shake like it contained the secrets of the universe. They were laughing about something on a tablet screen, probably a video of some cadet washing out in spectacular fashion. The kind of humor that develops when you spend your days watching people try to do something that most of them aren't cut out for. "Help you?" The aviator guy looked up, his tone carrying that particular brand of boredom that said he'd already decided she didn't belong there before she'd even opened her mouth. Serafina stopped in front of their makeshift desk, her posture straight but not rigid. "Captain Serafina Hayes. I have a civilian access pass for Apache simulator time today." She pulled out the paperwork, unfolded it once and placed it flat on the table. "Slot booked for 9:30. Protein shake guy looked her over like she was a curiosity at a county fair, his eyes taking in her civilian clothes, her lack of visible military bearing, the way she stood there waiting patiently for them to do their jobs. "You want to what now?" "Fly the Apache simulator," she repeated, her voice level as a carpenter's square. The 2 men exchanged glances, and Serafina caught the look that passed between them. It was the same look she'd seen 1,000 times before, in a dozen different contexts, from people who thought they knew what she was capable of, based on what they could see on the surface. Aviator guy picked up her paperwork, and scanned it with the theatrical attention of someone reading a restaurant menu, then dropped it back on the table like it was contaminated. "Yeah, I see. Here's the thing," he drawled, leaning back in his chair with the kind of casual arrogance that came from holding a little bit of power over someone else's day. "We're running crew evaluations today. Birds not available for tourists." "The authorization is signed by your base director," Serafina said quietly, not moving from her position in front of the desk. "Don't care if it's signed by the president himself," Protein Shake Guy chimed in, his voice carrying the authority of someone who'd been doing this job for all of 6 months, and thought that made him an expert. "Apache is not a carnival ride. Those birds eat people who don't know what they're doing." Serafina didn't argue, didn't raise her voice, didn't even flinch. She just picked up her paperwork, folded it once, and stepped back toward a metal chair positioned near the tent's edge, where she could see the flight line stretching out into the distance. "You can wait all you want," Aviator Guy called after her, his voice carrying that particular smugness that comes from winning a battle you didn't even know you were fighting. "Answer is still going to be no." She sat down, placed her bag at her feet, and folded her hands in her lap. From where she sat, she could see the Apache simulator hangar shimmering in the distance, heat waves making it dance like a mirage. The two instructors went back to their tablet, shaking their heads and chuckling about the naive civilian who thought she could just walk in and fly military aircraft. "Some people watch Top Gun once and think they're Maverick," one of them muttered, loud enough for her to hear. Serafina closed her eyes and let the sound wash over her. Distant rotor thumps from the practice birds, the hiss of hydraulics, the metallic ping of cooling metal. These were the sounds that had been the soundtrack to half of Serafina's adult life. Sounds that still lived in her dreams, both the good ones and the ones that woke her up sweating in motel rooms that smelled like other people's regrets. The minutes ticked by slowly in the desert heat. Every so often, one of the instructors would glance her way and shake his head like she was a problem that would eventually solve itself if they just ignored her long enough. Serafina sat perfectly still, her breathing controlled and economical, her patience, the kind that came from learning to wait in places where moving at the wrong time could get you killed. She didn't check her phone, didn't fidget, didn't show any of the restless energy that defined most people her age. Her stillness was a testament to years of training, of disciplined waiting for the exact moment to act. Each slow breath she took was a quiet affirmation of her resolve, a silent promise to herself and to the ghosts she carried that she would not leave until her purpose was fulfilled. She remembered countless hours spent in stifling cockpits, waiting for clearance, for a break in the weather, for the signal to extract or engage. That discipline had saved her life, and the lives of others, more times than she could count. It wasn't stubbornness, but a profound understanding that some objectives required unyielding persistence. A young mechanic walked past, tool bags slung over her shoulder, grease under her fingernails. She looked at Serafina with curious eyes, taking in the stillness, the way someone could sit in the furnace heat without fidgeting or checking a phone every 30 seconds. "Ma'am," the mechanic said, slowing down. "You okay out here?" Serafina opened her eyes, just waiting. The girl nodded and kept walking, but she looked back twice before disappearing into the hangar. Something about the way Serafina sat there, perfectly still in the brutal heat, reminded her of her grandfather. Old Marines had that same quality. They could wait forever if they had to, and they never seemed to doubt that their patience would eventually be rewarded. Inside the operations tent, the air conditioning hummed its losing battle against the desert, and Serafina Hayes continued to wait. She'd made a promise to someone who couldn't keep it himself anymore, and she intended to see it through, no matter how long it took, or how many people thought she didn't belong there. The Apache simulator sat in its hangar, waiting too. Inside the main briefing room, the morning's flight instructors were getting their second wind after the initial wave of simulator runs. The air conditioning hummed overhead, fighting the desert heat that pressed against every window and door like a living thing trying to get inside. Folding chairs were arranged in loose rows facing a whiteboard covered in call signs, flight times, and weather updates that hadn't changed in hours. The same two instructors who turned Serafina away were holding court near the coffee station, regaling anyone who'd listen with their tale of the wannabe pilot still sitting outside in the heat. "I'm telling you, she's been out there for over 2 hours." Protein shake guy was saying, gesturing with his hands like he was describing a fish that got away. Just sitting there staring at the hangar like she's trying to will herself into the cockpit. A cluster of cadets laughed. These were the new ones, fresh from basic flight training, still young enough to think everything was either hilarious or terrifying with no middle ground. Their instructor patches were so new they still had the factory creases, and their confidence was the kind that came from not yet knowing how much they didn't know. "What's her deal?" asked one, a kid with a Texas drawl and enough self-assurance for 3 people. "Says she wants to fly the Apache sim," aviator guy replied, shaking his head with the weary patience of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "Got some paperwork that says she's qualified, but come on, look at her. Civilian clothes, no patches, no presents. Probably flew drones from some air-conditioned trailer in Nevada, and thinks that counts as combat experience." More laughter rippled through the group, the kind that comes easy when you're 22 and convinced you know everything there is to know about the world. "Did you see her hands, though?" The female mechanic from earlier had walked in, wrench still in her grip, her voice cutting through the chatter with the kind of observation that comes from actually paying attention. "They're scarred up pretty good. Don't get hands like that from video games." "Probably worked construction," someone suggested with a dismissive wave. "Or maybe she fixes motorcycles," another added, as if that explained everything. "Yeah, well, fixing motorcycles doesn't make you qualified to fly a $40 million weapons platform," aviator guy declared with the authority of someone who'd been doing this job for all of 6 months and thought that made him an expert on everything aviation-related. The conversation continued to flow around the room, each comment adding another layer to the story they were building about the woman outside. She was a dreamer, a wannabe, someone who'd watched too many movies and confused fantasy with reality. The kind of person who thought military service was about glory and adventure, instead of the grinding, dangerous work of keeping complex machines in the air and bringing everyone home alive. Nobody noticed the man who had entered through the back door of the briefing room. He moved with the kind of quiet authority that didn't need to announce itself, the way senior officers learn to walk after enough years of being the person everyone looked to when things went sideways. Air Marshal Robert Kemp was 57 years old and had been flying military aircraft since before some of these instructors were born. He'd commanded squadrons in 3 different conflicts, flown everything from Hueys to Blackhawks to birds that didn't officially exist in any government database. His uniform was pressed but not pristine, worn enough to show it got used regularly. His face carried the weathered look of someone who'd spent serious time in serious places, and his eyes held the kind of depth that came from making decisions that other people never had to think about. He'd come to Falcon Mesa for a routine inspection, the kind of dog and pony show that kept the bureaucrats happy and the funding flowing. But what he was hearing in this briefing room wasn't routine at all. "I'm just saying," one of the cadets was pontificating, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who'd never been tested by anything more challenging than a simulator malfunction. "If you want to play pilot, get Microsoft Flight Simulator. Don't waste our time with fantasy." Kemp stopped walking, turned toward the voices, and listened. "She's probably some rich lady going through a midlife crisis," another cadet added, his words drawing appreciative chuckles from his peers. "Wants to tell her book club she flew an Apache. Or maybe she's writing a blog," Protein Shake Guy suggested, his voice dripping with disdain. "Military wife tries combat flying. Clicks for days." The laughter that followed had an edge, too. It was the kind that turned from amusement to meanness without anyone noticing the transition. Kemp had heard enough. He'd spent enough years in the military to recognize the sound of people who thought they knew everything about someone they'd never bothered to actually see. He turned and walked back outside, leaving the briefing room to its jokes and assumptions. He had a feeling those jokes were about to age very poorly. The heat hit him like walking into an oven, even after all these years in desert postings. The Arizona sun still took your breath away, still reminded you that this was a place where nature didn't particularly care about human comfort or convenience. He pulled his cap down low and started walking toward the operations tent, his boots crunching on the gravel path that connected the buildings. That's when he saw her. She was exactly where the instructors had said she'd be, sitting in a metal chair at the edge of the tent's shade. But seeing her in person, Kemp understood immediately why the kids inside had gotten it so wrong. They were looking at her clothes, her lack of visible rank, her civilian status. They weren't looking at her. She sat with perfect stillness, back straight but not rigid, hands folded but ready to move. Her breathing was controlled, economical. She wasn't wilting in the heat or checking her phone or showing any sign of the restless energy that defined most people her age. She was a study in control and patience, the kind you learned in places where moving at the wrong time could get you killed. Kemp had seen that stillness before, in snipers waiting for their shot, in pilots preparing for night insertions behind enemy lines, in soldiers who'd learned that survival sometimes meant being able to disappear into yourself until the moment demanded action. As he got closer, she turned her head slightly, acknowledging his approach without breaking her composure. That's when he saw it. Behind her left ear, where her pulled-back hair revealed the line of her neck, was a tattoo, small, precise, done in black ink that had faded to charcoal with age. It wasn't decorative, wasn't artistic. It was functional, a mark of identification for people who couldn't carry ID cards into certain places. Kemp's breath caught in his throat. The design was simple but unmistakable. 2 crossed rotors beneath a stylized dagger, the whole thing no bigger than a quarter. Below it, in numbers so small they were almost invisible, he could make out the digits. 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers. But that wasn't what made Kemp's blood run cold. It was the additional mark below the numbers, a tiny arrow pointing downward, crossed by a single horizontal line. Tier 1 Direct Action. Kemp had seen that mark exactly 3 times in his career. Twice on posthumous award recommendations that he'd signed himself. Once in a classified briefing about operations that officially never happened. The woman sitting in front of him wasn't some civilian playing dress-up. She was a ghost from the deepest shadows of military aviation, the kind of pilot whose missions were redacted from official records, and whose existence was denied by 3 different government agencies. Everything about the morning suddenly made perfect, terrible sense. "Ma'am," Kemp said quietly, his voice carrying the respect that came from recognizing someone who'd operated in places most people couldn't even imagine. Serafina looked up at him with green eyes that held depths he couldn't read. There was something in her gaze that reminded him of deep water, calm on the surface, with currents running underneath that could pull you down if you weren't careful. "Sir," she replied, her voice neutral but not dismissive. She'd clearly made him as military from 50 feet away, probably from the way he walked more than anything else. "I couldn't help but notice your ink." He kept his voice low, conversational. "That's some very specific artwork." She didn't flinch, didn't try to cover it up, didn't deflect with humor or false modesty. Most people would have made some joke about youthful indiscretions or getting drunk in some foreign port. Serafina just looked at him with those steady green eyes and said nothing. "It is," she finally replied, offering neither explanation nor apology. "Mind if I ask where you got it?" Serafina studied his face for a long moment, reading things in his posture and bearing that the young instructors had completely missed. She was cataloging details, the way he held himself, the particular shade of weathering around his eyes, the unconscious authority in his stance, all the little tells that separated people who'd been in the sandbox from people who'd only heard stories about it. Then she spoke 2 words that confirmed everything Kemp suspected and feared. Hindu Kush. The Hindu Kush Mountains, Afghanistan, where Task Force 160 had run operations so classified they didn't appear in any official record. Where pilots flew missions that couldn't be acknowledged and completed objectives that couldn't be celebrated. Where the line between success and disaster was measured in inches and split-second decisions that determined whether everyone came home or whether families got folded flags and carefully worded letters about national security. Kemp felt something shift in his chest, a combination of respect, recognition, and the sudden understanding that he was looking at a legend he'd assumed was dead. "What's your call sign?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. "Ghost Actual." The name hit him like a physical blow. Ghost Actual. The pilot who'd flown the impossible insertion at Objective Red Sand, who'd extracted the team from the valley that satellite imagery said couldn't be reached by aircraft, who'd disappeared from all records after a mission that was too successful to acknowledge and too classified to commemorate. Standing in front of him, sweating quietly in the Arizona heat, was the woman who'd single-handedly redefined what was possible in rotary wing aviation, and his instructors had been laughing at her for over 2 hours. The weight of that realization settled on Kemp's shoulders like a lead blanket. He thought about the jokes in the briefing room, the casual dismissal, the complete failure to recognize that they were in the presence of someone whose service had literally rewritten the tactical manual for special operations aviation. "Jesus," he said quietly, then caught himself. "I'm sorry, ma'am. Your reputation precedes you." "Most people don't recognize the ink," Serafina replied, her voice carrying the kind of exhaustion that came from years of being invisible in plain sight. "Most people don't need to." Kemp looked back toward the operations tent, where her paperwork had been dismissed, then toward the briefing room where the jokes were probably still flying. His jaw tightened as he thought about the casual arrogance he'd witnessed, the complete lack of respect for someone who'd earned the right to be treated as more than a punchline. "Ma'am," he said, his voice carrying the authority of 30 years in uniform, "you'll fly today." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Something shifted in Serafina's posture at Air Marshal Kemp's words. Not relief exactly, but a subtle change from patience to readiness. She'd been prepared to wait all day if necessary, enduring the heat and the dismissive attitudes. But she'd also been prepared for this exact moment, when someone finally saw her for who she was, rather than who they assumed she was. "Thank you, Marshal," she said simply, her voice low, a quiet acknowledgement of the profound shift that had just occurred. Kemp turned and walked back toward the briefing room, his stride sharp and purposeful, a stark contrast to the easygoing saunter he'd adopted when he first entered. Behind him, Serafina remained seated, but the very air around her seemed to vibrate with a newfound energy. The waiting was over. The game, if one could even call it that, had irrevocably changed. Inside the briefing room, the raucous laughter and dismissive chatter died the moment Kemp walked through the door. His expression was dark enough to change the weather, a thundercloud of controlled fury that made the air itself seem to crackle. Everyone in the room suddenly found their phones or their notebooks incredibly interesting, their eyes glued to inanimate objects as if searching for answers that weren't there. "Which one of you turned away the woman outside?" His voice, quiet but laced with a lethal edge, carried the kind of authority that made people's spines straighten involuntarily. It wasn't a shout, but a low growl that promised severe consequences. Lieutenant Mark Stevens, the aviator guy, slowly raised his hand, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. He looked like a student caught cheating on a final exam, his face pale, a bead of sweat tracing a path down his temple despite the air conditioning. "That was me, sir, but she's not on the flight manifest, and we're running evaluations today," he stammered, trying to formulate an excuse, a rationale that might somehow mitigate the disaster he suddenly felt looming over him. "Did you look at her paperwork?" Kemp's eyes, normally deep and thoughtful, now held the sharpness of polished steel. "Yes, sir," Stevens managed, his voice barely a whisper. "But did you look at her?" The instructor's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, desperately searching for words that simply wouldn't come. His mind raced, replaying the morning's encounter, the casual dismissiveness, the easy jokes. It was all flooding back, but seen through a new, terrifying lens. "The woman sitting outside," Kemp continued, his voice deadly quiet, each word landing like a carefully placed stone, "has more flight time in Apache aircraft than everyone in this room combined. She's flown missions that don't exist, in places you can't pronounce, for reasons you don't have clearance to know." The room had gone completely silent. Even the hum of the air conditioning seemed to have stopped, replaced by the collective held breath of 24 military personnel. Cadets shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their youthful arrogance replaced by dawning horror. The veteran pilots in the room, those who had seen real combat and understood the nuances of classified operations, exchanged grim glances. They knew. They understood the terrifying implications of what Kemp was saying. This wasn't just a reprimand, it was an unveiling. "But more importantly," Kemp continued, his eyes sweeping the room like a searchlight, lingering on each face, ensuring his message resonated. "She has something most of you will never earn. The right to be here, He turned to the flight operations chief, a master sergeant who'd been watching the show with growing alarm. His own face a mask of disbelief and apprehension. "Get the simulator prepped. Full weapon systems, full navigation, full electronic warfare suite. No training wheels, sir." The master sergeant snapped to attention, his years of instinct taking over. "Sir, the insurance waiver for civilian access," he began, his voice trailing off as he mentally scrolled through regulations and protocols, trying to find a way to reconcile this unprecedented demand with standard procedure. "She's not a civilian." Kemp's stare could have cut glass, silencing any further protest before it could form. "Captain Serafina Hayes is retired military. Her clearance level is higher than mine." Protein shake guy Lieutenant Danny Morrison finally found his voice, a faint squeak escaping his throat. "Captain Hayes?" "But she said." His mind reeled, trying to reconcile the image of the unassuming woman outside with the thunderous pronouncement Kemp had just made. "She said exactly what she needed to say," Kemp interrupted, his tone suggesting that further questions would not be welcome. "You assumed the rest." He walked to the door, then paused and looked back, his gaze sweeping over the now stunned faces in the room. "Oh, and gentlemen, the next time a Night Stalker asks to fly one of your aircraft, the correct response is, 'Yes, ma'am. Right away, ma'am.' Are we clear?" A chorus of, "Yes, sir," followed him out the door, delivered with a newfound urgency and respect that had been sorely lacking moments before. Behind him, the briefing room erupted in whispered conversations and frantic Google searches. "Night Stalkers! Ghost Actual! Hindu Kush Operations!" The pieces were starting to come together, fragmented bits of rumor and classified lore, and nobody was laughing anymore. The young mechanic, Jessica Martinez, who'd spoken up earlier, sat quietly in the corner, her wrench forgotten in her hands. She'd known there was something different about the woman outside, something that didn't fit the easy assumptions her colleagues had made. Now she understood what it was. Respect. The kind that was earned in places where the margin for error was measured in heartbeats, and the stakes were higher than most people could imagine. She felt a profound sense of awe, mixed with a touch of vindication. She had seen something, felt an intuition, that these seasoned, or so they thought, instructors had completely missed. It was a lesson in itself, a quiet affirmation that sometimes the most important insights came from paying attention to the unseen, to the subtle cues that true experience emitted. Outside, Kemp walked directly to where Serafina was still sitting. She looked up as he approached, and he saw something different in her eyes now. Not anticipation exactly, but a subtle shift from patience to readiness, like a weapon being taken off safety, poised for action. "Simulator is yours," he said simply, his voice firm and devoid of the earlier anger, replaced now by a deep, unwavering respect. Full capabilities unlocked. Serafina stood, shouldered her bag, and nodded once. "Thank you, Marshal." As they walked toward the hangar, Kemp found himself matching her pace. There was something humbling about walking beside someone whose reputation existed only in whispered conversations and redacted files, someone who'd flown into the impossible and brought everyone home, then disappeared into the kind of civilian life that most people took for granted. The weight of her history, the silent burdens she carried, seemed to emanate from her, a gravitas that belied her unassuming appearance. "Can I ask you something?" he said as they approached the hangar doors. "Serafina's fine," she replied, offering a glimpse of the person beneath the legend. "Serafina," he corrected himself, a slight warmth entering his tone. "Why here? Why now? You could get sim time at any number of facilities with better equipment and less hassle." She was quiet for so long, he thought she wasn't going to answer. Then, so softly he almost missed it, she finally spoke. "Made a promise to someone who can't keep it himself anymore." Kemp nodded, understanding completely. In their line of work, the ghosts accumulated. You carried them with you wherever you went, and sometimes, keeping faith with the dead was the only thing that kept you sane. It was a bond that transcended time and rank, a shared burden among those who had stared into the abyss and lived to tell the unutterable tales. It was the silent language of warriors, a language spoken not in words, but in the quiet understanding of sacrifice and undying loyalty. This was the true cost of their profession, the unseen weight that shaped them long after the bullets stopped flying. They reached the simulator hangar, and Kemp pulled open the heavy door. Cool air rushed out, a blessed relief from the furnace outside, carrying with it the faint, metallic tang of ozone and machinery. Inside, the Apache flight simulator gleamed under fluorescent lights, a behemoth of aluminum and polymer, its cockpit identical in every detail to the real thing. Every switch, every display, every control surface had been replicated with the kind of precision that, in their line of work, made the difference between effective training and tragic failure. A small crowd had already gathered. Word traveled fast on a military base, especially word about legends walking among them. The female mechanic from earlier, Jessica Martinez, stood near the control booth, her eyes wide, with something approaching awe, a quiet reverence replacing her earlier curiosity. A handful of cadets, the same ones who'd been joking only minutes ago, had found flimsy excuses to be in the area, their earlier jests forgotten in the face of a dawning, uncomfortable realization. They shuffled nervously, casting furtive glances at the silent, composed woman, each trying to reconcile the figure they now saw with the caricature they had so carelessly created. Serafina walked directly to the simulator without acknowledging the audience. Her focus was absolute, a singular point of intensity that drew the gaze of everyone in the hangar. She moved with an innate grace, a fluidity that spoke of deep familiarity, like a musician approaching a well-loved instrument. She did a quick visual inspection of the cockpit, her hands moving with automatic efficiency, checking systems with the ingrained discipline of someone who'd done this thousands of times before. Every movement was economical, professional, with no wasted motion or unnecessary drama. She wasn't showing off. She was simply performing a ritual, a silent communion with the machine that had been an extension of her very being for decades. The subtle flex of her fingers as she ran them over the worn edges of the controls, the slight tilt of her head as she scanned the pre-flight readouts. These were the tells of a master at work, invisible to the uninitiated, yet profoundly significant to anyone who truly understood the dance between pilot and machine. She climbed into the pilot's seat, settling into the familiar contours as if it were a second skin. Her hands moved across the controls with muscle memory precision, flipping switches and adjusting settings without conscious thought. The simulator screens came alive, displaying the familiar landscape of a training scenario. But Kemp noticed something the others didn't. The scenario loading on the screens wasn't one of the standard training programs. Somehow, perhaps through some hidden default setting or a system glitch, the simulator had defaulted to a very specific, highly classified mission profile: Objective Red Sand. A chill ran down Kemp's spine. Despite the cool air of the hangar, Objective Red Sand, the same operation that had made Ghost Actual a legend. The same operation that had cost Serafina's co-pilot, the father of the boy graduating next month, his life. It was a mission that pushed the boundaries of rotary wing aviation, a crucible of impossible odds and split-second decisions. This wasn't a standard training exercise. It was a ghost from her past, brought to vivid, simulated life. Serafina saw it too. Her hands paused for just a moment over the controls, hovering inches from the familiar stick and collective, and Kemp saw something flicker across her face. It was a fleeting shadow. Pain, memory, the unbearable weight of carrying ghosts who whispered in the dark about promises that couldn't be kept and missions that could never be discussed. For a fraction of a second, the legendary Ghost Actual seemed to falter, a human vulnerability laid bare. But then, as swiftly as it appeared, her training took over. The flicker of emotion was gone, replaced by an almost terrifying intensity. Her jaw tightened imperceptibly, her eyes sharpening, now reflecting the cold, calculated focus of a predator. She initialized the mission parameters and began her approach. This wasn't just a flight, it was a reckoning. What happened next was like watching poetry written in rotor wash and hydraulic fluid. The simulated Apache lifted off with the smooth grace of a bird that had never doubted its ability to fly. Serafina's control inputs were so subtle they were almost invisible. Tiny adjustments that kept the aircraft in perfect trim as she navigated through the virtual mountains of Afghanistan. On the massive screens surrounding the simulator, the audience watched in stunned silence as she flew a profile that most of them had only heard described in hushed tones, almost mythical in its impossibility. Nap of the Earth flight through terrain that satellite imagery said was impassable. Insertion into a landing zone that existed only in the space between two cliff faces, with margins for error measured in inches rather than feet. She made it look effortless, a seamless extension of her will into the complex machinery. The mission scenario threw everything at her, a relentless barrage of challenges designed to break even the most experienced pilots. Mechanical failures, sudden, violent weather changes, relentless enemy fire, communications jamming, each obstacle appeared with brutal realism. Yet, Serafina handled each challenge with the calm competence of someone who'd faced them all before. Not in a simulator, but in places where simulation meant the difference between coming home and being listed as missing in action. She didn't hesitate, didn't panic, didn't even seem to draw an extra breath. Her responses were instantaneous, almost preternatural, as if she could anticipate the simulator's next move. When a simulated surface-to-air missile locked onto her aircraft, a piercing shriek filling the hangar, she didn't panic or freeze. She simply executed a series of evasive maneuvers that defied physics and common sense, dancing the Apache through the virtual air like it was performing a ballet instead of fighting for its life. Her hands were a blur of motion, her feet working the rudder pedals with precise, almost unconscious skill, making the multi-ton attack helicopter pirouette and weave with impossible agility. The cadets watched, their mouths agape, having only seen such maneuvers in carefully choreographed training videos. This was raw, instinctive, combat-honed flight, a level of mastery that transcended textbook procedures. When the weather closed in and visibility dropped to zero, the screens plunging into an opaque white, she didn't slow down or abort. She switched to instruments, her eyes darting across the digital displays, but her true navigation seemed to come from a deeper place. She kept flying, navigating by feel and instinct through mountain passes that existed only in her memory and on classified maps. It was an old-school approach, a reliance on raw pilotage and spatial awareness that many modern pilots, accustomed to advanced avionics and GPS, had allowed to atrophy. This was the first subtle hint of the old helicopter advantage manifesting. A pilot not reliant solely on the latest tech, but deeply connected to the fundamental art of flight. The air in the hangar was thick with anticipation, the only sounds the whirring of the simulator's cooling systems and the simulated roar of the Apache's engines. Even Air Marshal Kemp, a hardened veteran of countless real-world operations, found himself leaning forward, mesmerized by the display of pure, unadulterated skill. He had heard the whispers, read the redacted reports, but witnessing Ghost actual in action was something else entirely. It was like watching a ghost materialize, not just in the air, but in the very fiber of the machine. The casual dismissal, the jokes, the arrogance of the instructors, it all seemed utterly ludicrous now, a stark testament to their monumental misjudgment. This wasn't just a flight demonstration, it was a masterclass in survival, a quiet, devastating rebuttal to every assumption made about her. When the simulated radio crackled with urgent reports of wounded friendlies at the extraction point, her voice filled with static and panic, Serafina didn't hesitate. The situation was grim, a textbook example of a hot LZ, a landing zone under heavy enemy fire, too small, too hot, and too dangerous for any sane pilot to attempt a pickup. Most pilots, even seasoned combat veterans, would have aborted, called for artillery, or sought a less perilous alternative. But Serafina had operated beyond sanity for years. She put the Apache into a landing zone that defied logic, a patch of rubble and shadow that seemed barely large enough for a single rotor blade. And she made it look easy. She brought the Apache into a hover just above the ground, using the aircraft's bulk, its hardened belly and powerful rotors, to shield the wounded from enemy fire while they were loaded aboard. Enemy rounds sparked off the simulated armor with chilling realism, each impact registering with a harsh thud that reverberated through the hangar. Warning lights flashed an urgent, angry symphony on the instrument panel, hydraulic pressure dropping, engine temperature spiking, rotor RPM fluctuating dangerously. The damaged engine, which had already given her trouble, threatened to fail completely, sputtering and groaning with simulated protest. And through it all, Serafina held the aircraft steady as a rock, an immovable fortress in a storm of lead, giving the ground forces the precious seconds they needed to complete the extraction. Her hands, calloused and strong, worked the collective and cyclic with the precision of a surgeon, her feet dancing on the rudder pedals, making micro-adjustments that kept the battered bird balanced on the razor's edge of control. The hangar had fallen completely silent, save for the hum of the simulator's cooling systems and the distant, muffled sound of real aircraft on the flight line outside. Even the cadets who'd been joking about her earlier were watching with the kind of focused, wide-eyed attention that comes from witnessing something that changes your fundamental understanding of what's possible. Their faces, a few minutes ago etched with smug amusement, were now pale with a mix of fear, awe, and grudging respect. The sheer audacity of her maneuvers, the impossible precision under extreme duress, was rewriting their mental textbooks in real time. In the control booth, the flight operations chief was staring at his instruments with the expression of someone who couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. The performance parameters Serafina was achieving weren't just good, they were impossible. The kind of numbers that suggested either a malfunction in the simulator or a pilot who operated on a completely different level from everyone else. "Is the sim running correctly?" he asked the technician beside him, his voice strained. "All systems nominal," came the terse reply. "She's just that good." Through the cockpit canopy, they could see Serafina's face, calm, focused, completely absorbed in the task at hand. This wasn't someone playing with expensive equipment or trying to prove a point. This was someone doing what she was born to do, in the environment where she belonged, in the very heart of the storm. The mission scenario continued to escalate, throwing challenges at her that would have overwhelmed most pilots. But Serafina handled each one with the kind of professional competence that made the impossible look routine. And in the back of the hangar, Air Marshal Kemp watched it all, with the quiet satisfaction of someone who'd been proven right about something profoundly important. The woman they dismissed as a wannabe was demonstrating a level of skill that most pilots could only dream of achieving. But more than that, she was reminding everyone in the room what real excellence looked like. Not the flashy, attention-seeking kind that demanded recognition, but the quiet, professional kind that got the job done and brought everyone home. The kind that earned respect instead of demanding it. The simulated mission continued to unfold on the screens around the hangar, and with each passing minute, the audience grew larger. Word was spreading through the base like wildfire. The woman they dismissed is putting on a demonstration that will be talked about for years. Serafina's hands moved across the controls with the fluid precision of someone who'd internalized every aspect of the aircraft. She wasn't flying the Apache so much as becoming part of it, extending her senses through its systems until the helicopter responded to her thoughts as much as her touch. On the main display, the virtual landscape of Afghanistan rolled beneath her simulated aircraft, mountains that had claimed dozens of real helicopters and hundreds of real lives, valleys where the margin between success and catastrophe was measured in seconds and split-second decisions that determined whether families received medals or folded flags. The mission scenario was pulling no punches, relentless in its intensity. Surface-to-air missiles tracked her movement, their digital trails arcing across the screen. Small arms fire erupted from concealed positions, a hail of simulated bullets impacting the aircraft. Weather systems moved in with the speed and ferocity that made the Hindu Kush one of the most dangerous flying environments in the world. Serafina handled it all with the calm competence of someone who'd been there, done that, and brought everyone home. This wasn't about the newest helicopter or the flashiest tech. It was about the pilot, the one whose instincts were honed by years in older birds, in situations where only sheer skill and unconventional thinking could save you. Then came the announcement that sent a fresh wave of tension through the hangar. "Mechanical failure, port engine." The simulator announced it in the flat, emotionless voice of a computer that didn't care about the terrifying implications of what it was saying. In the control booth, the flight operations chief leaned forward, his face etched with grim concern. Engine failures in mountain terrain were one of the most challenging scenarios they ran. Most pilots needed several attempts to successfully complete an emergency landing in these conditions. Some never managed it at all. This was the moment of truth, the ultimate test. It was here, in this simulated crisis, that Serafina's unique, old helicopter approach would truly shine. Her response was immediate and precise. She reduced power to the failing engine, the simulated rotors groaning in protest, and adjusted her flight path to compensate for the asymmetric thrust, her hands making a series of fluid, practiced movements that seemed to defy the sudden imbalance of the aircraft. Simultaneously, her eyes scanned the virtual terrain below, searching for emergency landing sites, a needle in a haystack of jagged peaks and shadowed ravines. All of this happened in the space of seconds, with no wasted motion or unnecessary drama. "There," she said quietly, her voice a low murmur that barely carried beyond the cockpit, spotting a small clearing between two ridgelines that most pilots would have dismissed as too small, too rough, or too dangerous. It was a patch of ground that a modern, fully functioning aircraft might have struggled with, let alone one on a single struggling engine. But for Serafina, trained in older, less forgiving aircraft where every landing was a calculated risk, this was a challenge she was built for. She brought the Apache down in a controlled auto-rotation, a maneuver that transformed a falling aircraft into a controlled descent, managing the aircraft's energy with the kind of skill that made the impossible look routine. The simulated helicopter touched down hard but safely, its skids finding purchase on ground that existed only in the space between disaster and success. It was raw, uncompromising pilotage, the kind that relied less on automation and more on the deep, intrinsic connection between pilot and machine. It was precisely the kind of skill, honed in situations where a newer helicopter with advanced systems might have failed due to over-reliance on technology, that was now her only escape route. The hangar erupted in spontaneous applause. It wasn't the polite recognition you'd give to a competent performance, but the kind of genuine, heartfelt appreciation that came from witnessing something truly exceptional, something that bordered on the miraculous. The sound was deafening, a cascade of claps and cheers that filled the cavernous space. Serafina didn't acknowledge the applause. Her focus remained absolute. She was already running through her post-landing checklist, preparing for the next phase of the mission, because in the world she'd operated in, there was always a next phase, always another challenge waiting just around the corner. The simulation continued. Ground forces needed extraction from a scorching hot landing zone, enemy contact was imminent, and time was running out. The damaged engine, though still sputtering, needed to be brought back online. Serafina restarted the engine, a procedure that in real life would have been both dangerous and desperate, requiring a specific sequence of actions that few would attempt in such conditions. But in the context of this mission, with lives hanging in the balance, it was absolutely necessary. The Apache lifted off again, struggling with reduced power, its single working engine roaring a defiant protest, but still capable of flight. What followed was a demonstration of tactical flying that bordered on the supernatural. Serafina threaded the aircraft through mountain passes that seemed too narrow for anything larger than a bird, using terrain features to mask her approach, appearing and disappearing like a ghost in the landscape. She flew with an almost reckless abandon, pushing the simulated aircraft to its absolute limits. Yet every movement was controlled, every risk calculated. She wasn't just flying, she was weaving, dancing, outsmarting a simulated enemy and an equally simulated environment. When she reached the extraction point, the situation was even worse than advertised. The landing zone was under heavy fire, a maelstrom of simulated tracer rounds and explosions. Smoke obscured visibility, reducing the world to a hazy, dangerous canvas. Wounded soldiers were scattered across terrain that made a normal landing impossible, their digital cries for help echoing through the comms. Serafina didn't hesitate. This was the moment for which every pilot was trained, the moment where the line between hero and casualty was razor thin. She brought the Apache into a hover just above the ground, a breathtaking display of precision control, using the aircraft's bulk to shield the wounded from enemy fire while they were loaded aboard. Enemy rounds sparked off the simulated armor, a terrifying symphony of impacts. Warning lights flashed an urgent, angry chorus on the instrument panel. The damaged engine, already struggling, threatened to fail completely, its simulated protests growing louder, more erratic. And through it all, Serafina held the aircraft steady as a rock, giving the ground forces the time they needed to complete the extraction. Her hands were a blur of motion, her feet dancing on the rudder pedals, making micro-adjustments that kept the battered bird balanced on the razor's edge of control. When the last wounded soldier was aboard, a small icon on the screen indicating success, she pulled the Apache up and out of the landing zone with the kind of violent grace that made physics look like a polite suggestion rather than an immutable law. The ascent was steep, defiant, defying the damaged engine and the heavy load. The return flight was a running battle against time, weather, and mechanical failure. The damaged engine finally gave up completely, a simulated explosion rocking the cockpit, leaving Serafina to nurse the aircraft home on single-engine power through mountain terrain that had been challenging enough under normal conditions. It was a test of raw skill, intuition, and an almost supernatural understanding of the aircraft's limits, a testament to the decades of flying older, less forgiving machines where every system failure was a direct threat. She made it look like she was taking a leisurely Sunday drive through the countryside, effortlessly navigating the treacherous virtual peaks and valleys. When the mission scenario finally ended, the screens faded to black, and the simulator powered down with a soft hiss. Serafina removed her helmet, the slight sheen of sweat on her brow the only sign of the incredible exertion she had just endured. She climbed out of the cockpit with the same quiet efficiency she'd shown climbing in, her movements precise and economical. The hangar was completely silent for a moment, the applause having died with the mission's conclusion, replaced by a profound, palpable awe. Then, someone started clapping. Slowly at first, a single set of hands, then with growing enthusiasm as others joined in, until the sound swelled to a thunderous roar. It wasn't the kind of applause you give to a good performance. It was the recognition due to someone who had just demonstrated mastery of something most people couldn't even attempt. It was the sound of respect, hard-earned and freely given. Serafina didn't acknowledge the applause. She simply picked up her bag and walked toward the door, her obligation fulfilled, her promise kept. Air Marshal Kemp intercepted her at the exit. For a moment they stood facing each other, two professionals who understood the weight of service and sacrifice, the cost of carrying ghosts, and the quiet satisfaction that came from doing difficult things exceptionally well. That was. Kemp began, then stopped, searching for words. There weren't words for what he had just witnessed. Not in English anyway, not any that could truly capture the essence of her performance. It had been beyond extraordinary, beyond anything the simulator could truly replicate, because it was infused with the spirit of real-world combat and an unparalleled, unconventional skill set. "It was an honor," he said finally, his voice thick with emotion, his gaze filled with the deepest respect. Serafina nodded once, a brief, almost imperceptible dip of her head, then walked out into the Arizona heat, her figure disappearing across the tarmac, a whisper of wind and dust following in her wake. The legend for a few hours had walked among them, and the base would never be the same. Behind her the crowd slowly dispersed, but the conversations would continue for hours, years maybe. The awe, the shock, the dawning realization of what they had just witnessed rippled through the hangar, turning whispers into excited chatter, then into fervent discussions. The sheer impossibility of Serafina's flight, particularly the single-engine landing and the impossible extraction under fire, cemented her place in their minds not just as a skilled pilot, but as a living legend. The young mechanic, Jessica Martinez, approached Kemp as he watched Serafina disappear across the tarmac. Her wrench, still clutched in her hand, felt impossibly heavy, no longer just a tool, but a symbol of the mundane against the extraordinary. "Sir," she said quietly, her voice hushed, reverent. "Was she really?" Jessica couldn't even finish the question, the implications too vast to articulate. "She was," Kemp confirmed, his voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty, his eyes still fixed on the disappearing figure, the best of the best. The kind they don't make anymore. There was a profound sadness in his tone, a lament for a bygone era of aviation mastery, for skills perhaps lost or forgotten in the age of advanced automation. "Why did she leave?" Jessica asked, genuine curiosity in her voice, a desire to understand the enigma that had just materialized and vanished. Kemp was quiet for a long moment, watching the heat waves dance off the concrete, distorting the world like a shimmering mirage. The question hung in the air, loaded with unspoken history and sacrifice. "Because sometimes the mission ends, but the war doesn't," he finally replied, his gaze still fixed on the horizon, "and sometimes the only way to honor the dead is to keep living." Jessica nodded like she understood, though Kemp suspected she was years away from truly comprehending what he meant. That was okay. Understanding came with time, and experience, and losses that accumulated like scar tissue around your heart. It was a truth learned not in classrooms or simulators, but in the crucible of real-world combat, in the quiet moments of reflection after a mission gone sideways or a friend lost. As Serafina's figure disappeared into the distance, Kemp found himself thinking about ghosts, the ones she carried, the ones he carried, the ones that kept them all honest and grounded and committed to something larger than themselves. In the end, that's what separated the real warriors from the pretenders. Not the uniform or the rank or the number of hours logged in the cockpit. It was the willingness to carry the weight of responsibility even after the mission was over. Especially after the mission was over. It was the silent burden of knowledge, of having seen things and done things that most people could never imagine, and knowing that those experiences forever marked you, shaping your perspective and your purpose. By 1,600 hours, the word had spread through the entire base like a wildfire in dry grass. Every pilot, every crew chief, every cadet who'd been within 50 miles of Falcon Mesa had heard some version of the story. The woman they dismissed as a wannabe was Ghost Actual, the pilot who'd flown the impossible mission, the legend who disappeared into classified history and emerged years later as a quiet civilian asking politely for simulator time. The tale grew with each retelling, acquiring a mythical quality, yet at its core remained the undeniable truth of her unparalleled skill. In the mess hall, conversation stopped when Serafina walked in. Not because people were staring, though many were, but because they suddenly understood they were in the presence of someone whose service couldn't be quantified in normal terms. Someone who'd operated in the spaces between official recognition and necessary action, where heroism wasn't rewarded with parades, but with the quiet knowledge that you'd done what needed to be done, that you had stared into the void and brought people back from the brink. Serafina bought a bottle of water and a sandwich, ate in silence at a corner table, and left without fanfare, the same way she did everything, efficiently, professionally, without drawing unnecessary attention to herself. Her presence was a silent rebuke to the base's earlier hubris, a living testament to the fact that true greatness often hides in plain sight, unassuming and unadorned. The two instructors who turned her away that morning, Lieutenant Mark Stevens and Lieutenant Danny Morrison, sat at their own table, picking at their food and avoiding eye contact with anyone who might want to discuss the morning's events. The jokes that had seemed so funny a few hours earlier now felt like lead weights in their stomachs, each one a bitter pill of regret and humiliation. They felt the eyes of their peers on them, not with amusement, but with a mixture of pity and contempt. Their casual arrogance had been exposed, their limited understanding laid bare for all to see. "We should apologize," Lieutenant Morrison, the protein shake guy, said quietly, his voice lacking any of the confidence it had carried that morning. His shoulders were slumped, his posture defeated. "With what words?" Lieutenant Stevens, the aviator guy, replied, staring into his coffee like it might contain answers to questions he didn't know how to ask. "What do you say to someone like that? Sorry we didn't recognize you were a living legend?" The thought of such an apology felt inadequate, almost insulting in its triviality compared to the magnitude of their error. Their mistake had not just been a breach of protocol, but a profound failure of judgment, an insult to the very ethos of military service they claimed to embody. Across the room, a table of senior pilots was engaged in a heated discussion about classified operations in Afghanistan. They spoke in the careful language of people who knew that some stories couldn't be told, but who needed to process what they'd witnessed somehow. "The Red Sand operation," one of them was saying, his voice low enough that it wouldn't carry beyond their table. "I heard rumors about it, but I always thought—" "Yeah, well, apparently the rumors were true," another replied, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and grudging admiration. "And we just watched the pilot who made it happen put on a flying demonstration that'll be talked about for the next 20 years. It was a moment of profound revelation for them too, connecting the dots of whispered legends to a tangible, awe-inspiring reality. At the cadet table, the young pilots who'd been so quick with their jokes that morning were having their own reckoning. They'd learned something important about assumptions, about respect, and about the fundamental difference between confidence and arrogance. "I feel sick," one of them admitted, pushing his tray away untouched. His appetite vanished. "We all should," another replied, his voice heavy with self-reproach. "We acted like idiots." Their youthful exuberance had crashed headfirst into a brutal reality check, leaving them humbled and profoundly shaken. They understood now that the military wasn't just about rank and rules. It was about competence, about sacrifice, and about recognizing true excellence, even when it didn't come wrapped in a shiny uniform or announced by a blaring trumpet. Jessica Martinez sat alone in the corner, turning Serafina's words over in her mind, alongside the memory of the flight. She'd known there was something different about the woman who'd sat so still in the desert heat, something that didn't fit the easy assumptions her colleagues had made. Now she understood what it was: respect. The kind that was earned in places where the margin for error was measured in heartbeats, and the stakes were higher than most people could imagine. She felt a burning ember of inspiration ignite within her, a realization that her own path might lead far beyond the grease and wrenches of the hangar floor. The sky, she now understood, was not just for the privileged or the pre-approved, it was for those brave enough, skilled enough, and determined enough to claim it. Serafina Hayes had not just flown, she had opened a window into a different kind of possibility. Later that afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent toward the western mountains, painting the sky in fiery hues of orange and purple, the base settled into its evening rhythm. But something had fundamentally changed. The tremors of the morning's events had reached the upper levels of command, and people were starting to ask questions. Uncomfortable questions about how a decorated veteran had been treated, about assumptions made, and about opportunities missed. Colonel Patricia Williams, the base commander, sat in her office, reviewing incident reports with a cold, analytical precision. A woman with 25 years of military service, a sharp mind, and a reputation for not tolerating incompetence, she was not pleased with what she was discovering. The story, as it filtered up through the official channels and unofficial whispers, painted a clear, unflattering picture. A pilot of unparalleled skill, a true legend in a highly specialized field, had been dismissed out of hand by two junior officers, whose confidence far outstripped their experience. This was more than just a procedural lapse. It was a profound failure of judgment, a stain on the base's professionalism. The following morning, the atmosphere in Colonel Williams's office was thick with tension. Lieutenants Mark Stevens and Danny Morrison stood rigidly at attention in front of her desk. Their earlier swagger completely evaporated, replaced by a pallid, almost green complexion. They looked like schoolboys caught with their hands in the cookie jar, their eyes fixed on a point just over the colonel's left shoulder, desperate to avoid her formidable gaze. Behind them, Air Marshal Kemp sat quietly, his presence both supportive of the colonel and ominously silent for the two lieutenants. He was a stone sentinel, an unspoken reminder of the gravity of their transgression. "Let me make sure I understand this correctly," Colonel Williams said, her voice carrying the kind of calm that experienced soldiers knew meant deep, profound trouble. It was not a shout, but a quiet cutting blade. A retired special operations pilot presented proper authorization for simulator time, and you denied her request because? Her voice trailed off, inviting them to fill in the blank, though the unspoken implication was that there was no acceptable answer. Lieutenant Stevens swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Ma'am, she wasn't in uniform and we didn't recognize her credentials. We thought she was a civilian tourist." He tried to articulate a defense, but the words felt hollow, even to his own ears. "Did you examine her paperwork?" the colonel pressed, her eyes boring into him. "Yes, ma'am." "But did you verify her authorization with the appropriate channels?" A beat of excruciating silence. "No, ma'am, we assumed." "You assumed?" Colonel Williams's voice could have cut steel, each word enunciated with chilling clarity. "You assumed that someone who'd taken the time to obtain proper authorization, who'd presented valid documentation, and who'd requested specific simulator access was somehow not qualified to make that request." Lieutenant Morrison, the protein shake guy, found his voice, a faint, desperate plea. "Ma'am, we were running scheduled evaluations and the aircraft was—" "The aircraft was available," Colonel Williams interrupted, her voice gaining a steely edge. She turned to her computer and pulled up a file, its contents projected onto a nearby screen for all to see. Simulator schedule shows a 2-hour gap that afternoon specifically reserved for civilian access, the same gap that Captain Hayes had properly reserved. She paused, letting that sink in, then continued, her voice now a low, dangerous rumble. "Let me share some information about the woman you dismissed. Captain Serafina Hayes, Call sign Ghost Actual, 160 combat missions, 3 distinguished flying crosses, 2 silver stars. The only pilot in the history of special operations aviation to successfully complete a hot extraction from objective red sand, the very mission you all witnessed yesterday in the simulator. The silence in the room was deafening. Even the air conditioning seemed to have ceased humming, intimidated by the sheer weight of her words. Stevens and Morrison stood frozen, their faces pale, the magnitude of their error crushing them. Furthermore, Colonel Williams continued, her gaze sweeping over the 2 lieutenants like a searchlight. Captain Hayes' security clearance is higher than anyone in this room, including mine. Her service record is so classified that I need special authorization just to access the unredacted portions. She stood up and walked around her desk, her bearing radiating the kind of authority that came from commanding respect rather than simply demanding it. What you, gentlemen, did yesterday wasn't just unprofessional. It was a disgrace to everything this uniform represents. You had the privilege of meeting one of the finest pilots in military history, and you treated her like an inconvenience. Lieutenant Stevens shifted uncomfortably, sweat beading on his forehead. Ma'am, if we'd known that. That's exactly the problem, Lieutenant Stevens. Colonel Williams cut him off, her voice sharp. You should have known, not because of her reputation, but because any service member deserves basic respect and professional courtesy. You failed to provide either. Air Marshal Kemp spoke for the first time since entering the office, his voice calm but firm. Colonel, if I may? Please, Marshal. Kemp stood and faced the 2 lieutenants, his expression unyielding. Gentlemen, you're going to have a choice to make going forward. You can learn from this experience and become better officers. Or you can make excuses and continue to embarrass yourselves and this institution. He paused, letting his words sink in, then delivered the final, crushing blow. Yesterday you were in the presence of greatness, and you missed it completely. That's not a mistake you can afford to make again. In this business, the difference between recognizing excellence and dismissing it can be the difference between life and death. Colonel Williams nodded, a grim affirmation of Kemp's words. Lieutenant Stevens, Lieutenant Morrison, she stated, her voice devoid of emotion. You're both relieved of flight instruction duties pending a full review of yesterday's incident. You'll be reassigned to ground operations until you complete additional training on professional conduct and operational procedures. The 2 men's faces went pale. Flight instruction was a prestigious assignment, and losing it was a significant blow to their careers, a public humiliation that would follow them. Furthermore, the colonel continued, you'll both write formal letters of apology to Captain Hayes. Those letters will be reviewed by myself and the Marshal before being sent, and they will meet the highest standards of military courtesy and professionalism. Yes, ma'am. Both men replied, their voices barely above whispers, their spirits thoroughly broken. You're dismissed. After the lieutenants left, Colonel Williams and Air Marshal Kemp sat in contemplative silence. How bad is this going to be? The colonel asked, leaning back in her chair. Honestly, it could have been much worse, Kemp replied, a sigh escaping his lips. Captain Hayes handled the situation with remarkable grace. A lesser person might have made this a much bigger issue, gone directly to command, or even the media. She just wanted to fly. Any word on her current status? Is she planning to file a complaint? Kemp shook his head. She's already gone, checked out of her motel this morning. I suspect we won't be seeing her again. Colonel Williams sighed. I hate that this happened on my base. We're supposed to be better than this. We are better than this, Kemp assured her. 2 young officers made a mistake, born of inexperience and poor judgment. The important thing is how we respond to it, and how we ensure it never happens again. Outside the colonel's office, word of the confrontation was already spreading through the base's informal communication network, that mysterious system by which important information traveled faster than official channels, fueled by hushed phone calls and knowing glances. Jessica Martinez heard about it while working on a helicopter engine in Hangar 3. The news came from a sergeant who'd heard it from a clerk who'd been in the outer office when the dressing down occurred. They got relieved of duty, the sergeant reported, with the satisfaction of someone who'd witnessed justice being served. Both of them reassigned to ground operations pending retraining. Jessica felt a complicated mix of emotions. Part of her was satisfied that the men who disrespected Serafina Hayes were facing consequences for their actions, but another part of her felt a pang of something akin to pity for them. They were young, like her, and they'd made a mistake that would follow them for the rest of their careers. "Think they'll learn from it?" she asked. The sergeant shrugged. "Some do, some don't. But at least now they know that actions have consequences." That afternoon, Jessica found herself thinking about the wings Serafina had given her. They sat on her nightstand in the barracks, wrapped carefully in the same faded cloth. Every time she looked at them, she remembered Serafina's words about excellence and belonging, and the sky not caring about other people's opinions. She'd made a decision. Next week, she was going to submit her application for pilot training, not because she wanted to prove anything to anyone else, but because she wanted to prove something to herself. The sky was waiting. It always had been. And now she knew that the only permission she needed was her own. 3 months later, the spirit of Falcon Mesa Air Base had undergone a subtle but profound transformation. Jessica Martinez stood in the same operations tent where Serafina Hayes had been so casually dismissed. But everything was different now. The 2 lieutenants who had presided over that desk with such misplaced arrogance were gone, replaced by senior instructors who understood that respect was earned through competence, not given based on assumptions or rank. The air conditioning still hummed its losing battle against the desert heat, but the atmosphere within the tent felt lighter, more receptive, less burdened by the unspoken judgment that had once permeated it. Jessica was no longer just a mechanic. Her pilot training application had been approved, and she was beginning the long, arduous journey toward earning her wings. The very same wings that Serafina had given her sat in a place of honor in her barracks room, carefully wrapped in their faded cloth, a constant, tangible reminder of what was possible when you refused to let other people define your limitations. Every time she faced a challenge in her ground school classes, every time she doubted her ability to grasp complex aerodynamic principles, she would look at those wings. They were more than just a symbol. They were a silent promise, a whisper of a legend, urging her forward. She remembered Serafina's quiet strength, her unwavering focus, and the effortless way she had commanded a machine designed for war, making it dance through the simulated Hindu Kush. That memory became her anchor, her beacon in moments of doubt. The story of Ghost Actual's visit to Falcon Mesa had become part of the base's unofficial history, a piece of folklore passed down through the ranks. New arrivals heard it during their orientation, usually told by someone who had been there that day, their voice hushed with reverence. It served as a powerful cautionary tale about the dangers of assumptions and an inspiring testament to the true nature of excellence, depending on who was listening. No one openly scoffed at anyone's credentials anymore, and a quiet dignity settled over interactions, particularly between those in different roles. The incident had forced a much-needed introspection across the base, prompting many to reevaluate their own biases and preconceived notions. Air Marshal Kemp, a man whose 28 years of service had taught him when it was time to step aside and let younger officers take the lead, would be leaving Falcon Mesa at the end of the month for his retirement. But before he left, he wanted to make sure the lessons of that desert morning weren't forgotten. He instituted a new policy for civilian aircraft access requests. Instead of allowing junior officers to make arbitrary decisions based on their initial impressions, all such requests now required review by senior personnel. More importantly, they required that the requesting individual be treated with the respect due to anyone who had taken the time to follow proper procedures. "The military is built on respect," he told the incoming instructor staff during their briefing. "Respect for the chain of command, respect for procedures, and respect for each other. When we fail to show that respect, we fail as an institution." That morning was a stark reminder of that. Colonel Williams had made her own significant changes. The base now hosted quarterly seminars on professional conduct and diversity awareness. These were not the kind of mandatory training sessions that people sat through while thinking about lunch, but serious, engaging discussions about unconscious bias and the profound importance of recognizing excellence in all its forms, regardless of outward appearance or conventional expectations. She had also established a new award, a deeply personal and meaningful one, the Ghost Actual Excellence in Aviation Award, to be given annually to the pilot who best exemplified the kind of quiet professionalism and unwavering competence that Serafina Hayes had demonstrated. The first recipient was a young female pilot who had completed a difficult rescue mission in adverse weather conditions, bringing home a crew that many had written off as lost. The award citation read simply, "For demonstrating that excellence speaks louder than words, and that true professionals measure success by the people they bring home, not the recognition they receive." It was a powerful statement, echoing the silent, sacrificial service of the woman who had inspired it. Serafina Hayes herself had disappeared back into civilian life as quietly as she'd emerged from it. Camp had tried to track her down, wanting to apologize personally for the treatment she'd received and to offer a more formal commendation, but she'd covered her tracks too well. It was as if Ghost Actual had lived up to her call sign one final time, vanishing into the vast expanse of America like smoke in the wind, leaving only her impact behind. Her life was now her own, free from the demands of duty and the weight of official recognition. But her impact remained. In flight schools across the country, instructors told the story of the quiet woman who'd proven herself through excellence rather than argument. In maintenance hangars, mechanics reminded each other that respect was something you gave freely, not something you withheld until someone proved they deserved it. And in a small apartment in Ohio, a young man named David completed his final flight training exercise and prepared to receive his pilot's wings. He bore a striking resemblance to his father, the co-pilot who'd flown with Ghost Actual in the Hindu Kush Mountains all those years ago. David had no idea that, somewhere out there, a woman who'd promised his father she'd keep flying was finally able to sleep without nightmares for the first time in years. Her promise had been kept. Her ghosts could finally rest. The completion of his journey, a mirror of his father's, was Serafina's ultimate peace, a silent vindication of her sacrifices. In the vast, endless Arizona sky above Falcon Mesa, the helicopters continued their eternal dance, their rotors churning the air in a timeless rhythm. But the pilots who now guided them, and the ground crew who supported them, carried a new understanding. The arrogance that had once festered subtly among some of the younger ranks had been cauterized by the truth of Captain Serafina Hayes. The sky, they now collectively acknowledged, truly belonged to anyone brave enough, skilled enough, and dedicated enough to claim it, regardless of the uniform they wore, the rank they held, or the assumptions others made about them. Jessica Martinez, deep into her pilot training, felt this shift profoundly. As she learned the intricate dance of controls and the complex physics of flight, the memory of Serafina's impossible maneuvers in the simulator became a guiding star. She remembered Serafina's words about proving them wrong by being excellent, period, and she absorbed them, not as a challenge to others but as a personal creed. Jessica pushed herself harder, seeking to understand not just the mechanics but the very soul of the aircraft. She embraced the lessons that taught improvisation, adaptability, and the kind of gut instinct that couldn't be programmed into the most advanced avionics. These were the lessons that Serafina, in her simulated old helicopter that defied conventional wisdom, had so dramatically demonstrated were the true path to survival when all else failed. Jessica knew, deep in her bones, that the best lessons were often the ones learned through humility, the ones that taught you to see true excellence wherever it appeared, to honor it accordingly, and to never let superficial judgments cloud your vision. The desert wind, a constant companion, picked up, carrying with it the distant, reassuring sound of rotor blades and the quiet, enduring promise of flight. The story of Ghost Actual's brief, impactful visit to Falcon Mesa had long since transcended mere anecdote. It had woven itself into the very fabric of the base's unofficial history, a powerful, living myth shared from seasoned sergeants to wide-eyed new recruits. It was told in hushed tones in the mess halls, with respectful awe in the briefing rooms, and with cautionary reverence during new cadet orientations. It served as a stark, enduring reminder, a cautionary tale about the corrosive nature of unchecked arrogance and the dangers of shallow judgment, and simultaneously, a boundless source of inspiration about the profound, often hidden, nature of true excellence. The culture of the base, once prone to a certain insular pride, had opened, embracing a new emphasis on humility, continuous learning, and a deeper respect for every individual's potential. Lessons learned in the simulator that day were integrated into new training modules, specifically emphasizing critical thinking and unconventional problem-solving, acknowledging that sometimes the old ways, or the unique ingenuity of a pilot honed in diverse, challenging environments, became the only viable escape route from modern perils. Air Marshal Kemp, now retired, looked back at his career with a quiet satisfaction, knowing that his final act of service had helped steer Falcon Mesa toward a brighter future. His implemented policies for civilian access requests were now standard procedure, ensuring that every individual, regardless of their outward appearance, was treated with due diligence and respect. Colonel Williams' quarterly seminars on professional conduct and diversity awareness were thriving, transforming moments of mandatory training into genuine opportunities for introspection and growth. The Ghost Actual Excellence in Aviation Award had become the most coveted honor on base, not for its prestige, but for what it represented. The recognition of quiet professionalism, the unwavering commitment to mission success, and the ultimate measure of competence, bringing everyone home, regardless of the personal cost. Somewhere out there, Serafina Hayes was living a life removed from the clamor of military service, a life of profound, almost sacred, privacy. Her unimaginable exploits, the missions that had carved her name into the deepest shadows of military aviation, remained her secret, known only to the silent ghosts she carried and the boundless sky she'd learned to call home. She didn't seek recognition, didn't crave the spotlight that would inevitably follow the revelation of her true identity. Her hidden legacy, however, continued to resonate, a powerful, unseen current shaping the future of military aviation. It lived in every pilot who now approached their craft with humility and integrity, understanding that genuine skill was the only true currency. It lived in every instructor who taught with respect, fostering an environment where potential was nurtured, not stifled. And it lived in every aspiring aviator who looked up at the boundless expanse of the sky, knowing with absolute certainty that they too belonged there, their aspirations no longer constrained by the narrow opinions of others. Her unique ability to coax impossible feats from an aircraft, a skill honed in environments where simpler, older platforms demanded more from the pilot, had demonstrated a profound truth. Sometimes, the most sophisticated escape isn't through cutting-edge technology, but through the unparalleled mastery of the human behind the controls, a mastery forged by experience that transcends generations of aircraft. The generals who once scoffed had learned that humility. The sun set over Falcon Mesa, painting the mountains in majestic hues of purple and gold, casting long, dramatic shadows across the desert landscape. The eternal dance of aviation continued, a timeless rhythm of ascent and descent, challenge and triumph. Some stories ended with grand recognition and public celebration, with medals pinned and parades cheered. This one, however, ended with something far more profound: the deep, quiet satisfaction of duty fulfilled and promises kept. Serafina's journey was not one for headlines or accolades, but for the profound inner peace that came from honoring the fallen and living a life true to the indelible lessons learned in the crucible of combat. And sometimes, carried on the desert wind, you could still hear the whisper of rotor blades, the distant, shimmering echo of excellence, and the quiet, undeniable testament of a legacy that would never be forgotten. A legacy built not on outward glory, but on unwavering skill, profound respect, and the unyielding will to bring everyone home. In the end, for Ghost Actual, that was legacy enough. The desert wind continued its ancient song across Falcon Mesa, carrying with it the faint scent of jet fuel and the distant, rhythmic thrum of helicopter blades. It was a sound that had echoed through the mountains for generations, a constant reminder of the human endeavor to defy gravity, to conquer the skies, and to serve a purpose larger than oneself. But now, that sound carried a new resonance, a deeper meaning for those who listened closely enough. It whispered of Captain Serafina Hayes, of Ghost Actual, and of the profound truth she had so quietly, yet so powerfully laid bare. Her flight, a simulated journey through a haunted past, had revealed that the truest measure of a warrior was not in their uniform or their accolades, but in the unwavering core of their being, the skill honed through impossible trials, the courage that never wavered under fire, and the silent, unyielding commitment to bring everyone home. The lessons from that day, particularly the revelation that her old helicopter wisdom, her raw, adaptable, unconventional mastery forged in the most unforgiving environments, could be the only escape route when cutting-edge technology faltered, permeated every level of training. It became a new pillar of their philosophy: reliance on fundamental pilotage, on intuition, and on the unyielding spirit of a pilot whose experience transcended any single machine. Falcon Mesa, transformed by the quiet power of her presence, became a testament to this truth. It was a place where instructors now actively sought out and nurtured unconventional problem solvers, understanding that innovation sometimes lay not in the newest gadget, but in the deepest wellsprings of human ingenuity and experience. Jessica Martinez, pushing through the rigorous demands of pilot training, was a living embodiment of this change. She carried Serafina's wings and her quiet resolve, a new generation rising, deeply rooted in the timeless virtues that Serafina had so magnificently exemplified. She understood that her path was not just about flying, but about honoring a lineage of unseen heroes whose legacies were woven into the very fabric of the sky. Serafina Hayes remained a ghost, vanishing back into the anonymity she preferred. Yet, her impact continued to ripple, a silent force shaping the lives and aspirations of those who would follow. Her story, though absent from official records, became part of the unspoken tapestry of courage that bound the military together. It was a reminder that true heroism often existed in the shadows, performed not for glory, but out of an unshakable sense of duty and a promise made to the fallen. And in that ultimate peace, knowing her promise had been kept, and her ghosts could finally rest, Serafina found a quiet solace that transcended any earthly recognition. The desert night fell, cool and vast, and above Falcon Mesa the stars glittered, infinite and indifferent, just as the sky had always been. They belonged to anyone brave enough to claim them, a silent invitation to a new generation, forever changed by the echo of excellence that had passed through their midst. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.